After the succession crisis of 1844, not every member of the church chose to sustain and follow Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and many of these members eventually formed or joined alternative restoration movements, which became separate, distinct, and independent churches from one another. In fact, over the last 180 years, there have actually been hundreds of churches that have branched off from the same Joseph Smith-era restoration trunk. Today on Church History Matters, for reasons we will explain, Casey and I have chosen to consider three such restoration branches, namely the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Strangites, the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Josephites, today known as the Community of Christ, and the Church of Jesus Christ, or Bickertonites. Our focus will primarily be on the question of how succession has developed and how it works today in each of these movements. I'm Scott Woodward, and my co-host is Casey Griffiths, and today Casey and I dive into our 9th episode in this series, dealing with succession in the presidency. Now let's get into it. Hello, Casey.
Hello, Scott. How are you?
Doing great. Excited to dig in today to some really interesting stuff.
Yeah, this is technically still part of succession.
Yeah.
But we've kind of wrapped up succession in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're doing something that I have wanted to do for a really long time, which is talk about some of our restoration cousins, some of our sister faiths in the movement, basically. So there's a lot of them out there.
Yeah, and there have been a lot of our listeners who have emailed us and said we'd love to learn more about succession and then the branches of the restoration as well. And that's kind of what got us moving in this direction, was our listener feedback to do this series, which I think has been really fun so far.
Yeah.
Now we're at that point where, we want to start talking about those other branches of the restoration now that we've covered ours all the way up through President Nelson.
Yeah.
So tell us kind of where we're going to go. How's this going to work?
Let's start with this. If you were to give me a ballpark figure of how many churches, movements out there trace themselves back to Joseph Smith and the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, what's your ballpark estimate?
Oh, man. A few years ago, we went to Missouri at a Book of Mormon conference there where there's a lot of people that love the Book of Mormon, but they're not Latter-day Saints. I was meeting people from churches that I'd never heard of. I was meeting people that were Book of Mormon believers who didn't go to church. They did a little house church with fellow believers, or they would Zoom with a few others. And that was their quote unquote church experiences. They would talk about the Book of Mormon. Mm-hmm. And so they weren't really branches of the restoration. They're more like twigs. So we got branches, we got twigs, we got, I don't know, what is it? 100 plus?
So the low estimate is 250.
Okay.
The high estimate is 400, and it depends on how you count movements. And so low estimate comes from Stephen Shields, who wrote a really awesome series of books called Diverse Paths of the Restoration, that he's actually kind of turned into encyclopedia. And he has everybody in there that he could even get an email from or find any information about. The high estimate comes from a book called Scattering of the Saints that was published a couple of years ago.
John
Hamer and Noel Bringhurst put that together. But I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot, and there's a ton of diversity. These restoration movements vary widely in size and beliefs. And I'm going to be honest with you, in our format, we're not going to do all of them. We're not going to do 400 episodes.
We are not.
On everyone. So we had to be a little bit selective, and no offense to any of these movements out here, because I know there are some people from other movements that listen to our podcast. So we set up some criteria. Scott and I discussed this. First thing we looked at was kind of how big are they? The biggest restoration movement after the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is Community of Christ. And so we felt like they should be on the list.
Yeah, definitely.
The third largest is probably the Church of Jesus Christ. This is based in Pennsylvania, but they're a growing faith. The beliefs in the Book of Mormon, we're going to highlight them today. But another factor that we looked at was how influential the movement's been on other restoration faiths.
Yeah.
And because of that, we also decided to include the Strangites. And that's another thing that I hope doesn't offend anybody, is you mentioned you went to Independence and there were all these different little churches.
Yeah.
And everybody kind of has their own name. There's like the Strangites, who are people that, believe James Strang was a prophet.
Yep.
And there's the Cutlerites who followed Alpheus Cutler.
Mm-hmm.
And we're known as the Brighamites in Independence.
Uh-huh. Yep.
And then there's the Josephites. Those are Community of Christ people, but they're not saying Joseph Smith. They're saying Joseph Smith III.
Yeah.
So we decided to include the Strangites as a short part of the story.
And the Strangites, their official name is Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Yes.
So no the and no hyphen.
Yeah.
So Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, parentheses, Strangite. Yeah.
Yeah. And they only have about 130 members today. That's according to their own website.
Mm-hmm.
But James Strang was really influential in a lot of the other restoration movements that sprung up after the death of Joseph Smith.
Especially Community of Christ, right?
Yeah, especially Community of Christ. Now, in the spirit of full transparency, too, we also chose some of these movements because we're involved in dialogue with them.
Mm-hmm.
And we have friends in each one of these movements. So we were able to get direct information from them. In the last couple of years, Scott and I have met with leaders from Community of Christ, leaders from the Joint Conference of Restoration Branches, which is another
Mm-hmm.
restoration movement around independence. A couple of weeks ago, I went to Pennsylvania and hung out with leaders from the Church of Jesus Christ, also known as the Bickertonites, and others. We're going to give you an overview today, but in the next couple of weeks, we're also going to invite people from these churches
Mm-hmm.
to come and explain themselves, because that's how you do good interfaith dialogue, is you allow people to speak for themselves and represent their own beliefs rather than talking about them. We're going to hear directly from them. So over the next few episodes, we're going to try and model good ecumenical interdenominational dialogue by bringing in guests. We'll let them explain themselves. And if we are inaccurate, any of our friends in these restoration faiths, we welcome corrections, and we will make those corrections too.
We have been, as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we have been misrepresented so much, and we know how that feels, and we never want to do that to anybody else.
Yeah.
That's our commitment.
Yeah. And we love these people. Like, honestly, some of them are my dear friends. There's such a small number of people that believe in the Book of Mormon and the restoration that we kind of want to stick together too.
Definitely.
And yet sometimes feelings run deep within families. And so we're going to be very careful and try and not run roughshod over anybody's beliefs.
Definitely.
Since we can't talk about everything and we want our guests to have time to talk about their beliefs, what we're looking at today specifically is how succession works in each one of these churches. So
Mm-hmm.
how do they choose the leaders of their church? And as a framing device, we're going to go all the way back to that model that we set up in our first episode on succession, where we used Mike Quinn's excellent article to lay out several different possible paths to succession that could have been followed in the wake of Joseph Smith's death. Our church followed succession by Quorum of the 12 Apostles, which gradually evolved into succession by seniority,
Yes.
by the senior apostle. But here's the 8 possible models that I'll review really, really quickly. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
There's succession by counselor in the first presidency. That would probably have meant somebody like Sidney Rigdon take over.
Mm-hmm.
There's succession by a special or secret appointment, which is the method that the Strangites believe in. This wasn't unprecedented. Joseph Smith had made a special appointment that David Whitmer was supposed to be his successor, but David Whitmer was excommunicated before Joseph was killed. There was succession through the office of associate president, which in our church was still coming up as late as Joseph F. Smith in the early 20th century. The idea that the associate president, who was Hiram Smith, had a special role, that's linked closely to the idea of the presiding patriarch being a successor too. That's plan number 4, if you're keeping count here too. Another possible route was succession by the Council of 50. Some people, like Lyman White and Alpheus Cutler, advocated for this. The Council of 50 was only 2 months old when Joseph Smith was killed, and so that didn't give it a lot of momentum. We mentioned we follow succession through the Quorum of the 12, but there were also some people that felt like if the 12 were equal according to Section 107, that the 12, the 70, and the stake presidents should form a kind of parliament that would choose the new leader of the church. And then there's option number 8, which is succession by a descendant of the prophet Joseph Smith, or lineal succession.
Okay.
So some of these models were suggested, but never really attempted, like succession through the presiding patriarch or succession through the 3 presiding councils.
Yeah.
Others were put into play, succession by the 12 apostles. There were groups that followed succession through a counselor. We've detailed how Sidney Rigdon and Brigham Young battled over who was supposed to lead the church. And one of the things we want to recognize is that while most church members followed Brigham Young and made the epic trek to the western United States, in the years following the death of Joseph and Hiram, several new movements began to emerge. And so we're going to consider each one of these. And it's kind of surprising, but after Brigham Young, the most numerically successful person was probably James Strang.
Yeah.
So let's launch into this, and we're going to start by talking about the Strangites.
Right. So let's talk James Strang, succession by special appointment.
Mm-hmm.
Let us back up and tell the story of James Strang. In the wake of Joseph Smith's martyrdom, the majority of church members follow the 12, as you mentioned, and they head west on the westward exodus. However, a surprising number of church members remained behind, seeking other alternatives to the leadership of Brigham Young. And the leader of one of the largest schismatic groups is generally unknown among church members today. We don't really talk about this very often today. That is this fascinating figure named James Jesse Strang. He's also known as the King of Beaver Island. And his rapid rise, along with his tumultuous reign, tragic death, and the shameful persecution of his followers, is actually one of the most colorful chapters in Mormon history that we never talk about. And so let me tell you a little bit about his background. So he lived really just a relatively quiet life till he was baptized into the church about 4 months before the martyrdom of Joseph Smith. All right, so mark that. 4 months before Joseph died, he joins the church. And he joined after hearing the gospel from family members where he was living out in Burlington, Wisconsin. So Strang journeys to Nauvoo, where he meets Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith, and other church leaders. And he's then baptized February 25th, 1844 there. And then he returns home, goes back to Wisconsin. A few months later, Joseph Smith is killed. After his death, Strang journeyed back to Nauvoo and claimed that he had possession of a letter that was sent to him by the prophet, dated June 19th, 1844, just days before the martyrdom. And so Strang actually approaches the 12 apostles with this letter that claimed that Joseph Smith had appointed him to be the successor. And he then commands the apostles and priests and elders of the church of the saints, I'm quoting now, that they communicate and proclaim this my word to all the saints of God, that they may be gathered. Woo. So he comes in with a pretty heavy hand saying, I've been appointed successor. I need you to announce, proclaim this word unto all the saints of God, that they may be gathered, right? That I am to be the successor. The letter commanded the saints to be gathered to Voorhees, Wisconsin, near where James was living at the time. And the letter was not actually in Joseph Smith's handwriting, which, you know, sometimes Joseph used scribes, and so maybe that was okay. Also, the signature didn't match the signature of Joseph Smith. But whatever, people continued to be intrigued by Strang. He also claimed to have received a vision where Joseph Smith ordained him as his successor on the very day of the martyrdom, June 27th, 1844. And so that's interesting, right? So he says the day Joseph died, he had a vision where Joseph Smith ordained him his successor. That, in addition to the letter, was all the proof he needed, right? So Brigham Young and the 12 evaluate Strang's claims and then excommunicate him on August 26th, 1844. So they were not having it at all.
You would kind of assume that's the end of the story, right? Because James Strang kind of comes out of nowhere.
Right.
And yet there's a couple things, like this letter, for instance, is canon to them. I believe it's in their scriptures. And if you go to their church's website, I think you can read the letter fairly easily there. But the letter is still a big deal to members of this church, and they talk at length about it. But I mean, the question is, he comes out of nowhere. Nobody really knows him. So why did he gather such a large group of followers? And not only like these weren't like vagabonds, some of the most influential people in the church that didn't follow Brigham Young eventually choose to follow James Strang. So what's this guy got going for him?
Yeah, I think part of the appeal of James Strang is in his claim of new scripture. Like in 1845, he claims to bring forth a new record, which is informally called the Voorhees plates. It's a record written on brass plates containing writings and drawings. Strang says that he translated the record by means of the Urim and Thummim and published a text of about 200 words. Now, is this sounding familiar at all, Casey?
Yeah.
You got a record of plates that he translated by the Urim and Thummim, Now, it's only 200 words, a little different than the Book of Mormon in terms of its length, but he says the plates he discovered in Voorhee, Wisconsin, and they contain the record of Raja Manchore of Vorito, who was a prophet whose people died in battle. The record ends with the cryptic prophecy. I'll read it right here. It says, quote, "The forerunner men shall kill, but a mighty prophet there shall dwell."
Yeah, and I should mention we have pictorial representations of these plates. You can see them, in Strangite writings. Although the plates themselves vanished around 1900 or so. So we don't have the actual plates.
Yeah.
But they do have pictures of these plates and some of the writing that's on them.
Yeah.
That have been published by the church that are fairly official. So
yeah,
he's bringing forth new scripture. That's got to be appealing to people. He's claiming miracles and angels. That probably appealed to people that saw the same thing in the early restoration with Joseph Smith.
Right. Sounds familiar. Sounds like he is coming right in the shadow of Joseph Smith, right in the groove of what Joseph Smith had done. And so this felt familiar, I think, to many saints. And then in 1851, Strang actually publishes what he calls the Book of the Law of the Lord. He described the book as, quote, "one of the lost books of the Bible, and had been so revered in ancient times that it was kept inside the Ark of the Covenant," close quote. Woo. He says the Book of the Law of the Lord was from the brass plates of Laban, mentioned in the Book of Mormon. It contained extensive counsel about all aspects of worshipful life and daily living. It has 47 different chapters in it, dealing with benedictions, maledictions, baptism for the dead, marriage, groves, forests and waters, highways, apparel and ornaments, social order, household relationships, tithing, everything else you can think of relating to daily life. I was actually reading it today, this morning, Casey, getting ready for this, and I happened upon the chapter on priesthood.
Interesting.
And I found Strang commenting on the succession crisis of 1844, where he lays out his logic as to why the 12 apostles led by Brigham Young were illegitimate. So let me just quote a little bit from the Book of the Law of the Lord, and this is Strang's commentary in there about the priesthood. He says, quote, "In the present dispensation, 12 apostles were called and ordained to this ministry. In 1837, a great falling away took place at Kirtland, and the 12 assumed authority in governing the church, in derogation of the right of Joseph the prophet. But God rebuked them, saying, quote, 'Rebel not against my servant Joseph, for verily I say unto you, I am with him, and my hand shall be over him.'" So this is a reference to the Kirtland apostasy, right? We have about 4 of the apostles at the time who are falling away or excommunicated. There's rebellion. Thomas B. Marsh counsels with Joseph, and Joseph receives what we know today as section 112, where that passage is that he just quoted, "Rebel not against my servant Joseph." He then goes on and says, "Notwithstanding this, at the death of Joseph, Brigham Young claimed in behalf of the 12 to supersede the entire first presidency and stand at the head of the church, urging upon the saints that such was the true order and that the 12 had not been suffered to fill their proper place during the lifetime of Joseph. And in this claim, he was sustained by an immense meeting of the saints, hurriedly assembled together at Nauvoo, the 8th of August, 1844. We talked about that meeting in great detail in a previous episode. He goes on, quote, "1 week later, Brigham put forth an epistle to the whole church vindicating this claim, and it was generally acceded to in the church. A very few followed the prophet James." That's what James Strang calls himself, the prophet James. "A very few followed the prophet James, and as the 12 could not stand against the arguments presented by his followers, they finally changed their position, acknowledged their former error, and attempted to patch it up by electing Brigham Young first president, Heber C. Kimball and Willard Richards counselors, which they accomplished at winter quarters, December 24th, 1847.
Oh, so he's writing this after they've decided to put together the first, I guess Book of the Law of the Lord comes out in 1851. So yeah,
That's right.
this is after they've reassembled the first presidency and they're doing their thing. And interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so he says that the formation of the first presidency at winter quarters was to patch up an error where the Quorum of the 12 did not have a right to lead the church. Super interesting. He goes on to say this. I'll wrap it up here. He says, "This did not help their case in the least, for the same law which placed the 12 under the direction of the first president made it necessary that the successor of Joseph should be appointed by revelation of God through him, and that he should be ordained by an angel, They only succeeded in bringing Brigham Young into the prophetic office by a revelation of the will of man and no ordination at all. Ah, shoot. At the same time, James, speaking of himself, stood in this priesthood, the heir of David, duly called by revelation of God to be a lawgiver, an apostle, and a prophet of the Most High God, ordained by the highest instituted power in heaven or on earth. 9 days before his martyrdom, Joseph Smith received and wrote a revelation containing this calling and put it in the confidential archives of the church, he says. At the same time, he sent the appointment to James in a letter. At the very moment of Joseph's death, he, James Strang, was ordained according to the law of God and has from that time filled the office. Only 2 of the 12, Johnny Page and William Smith, acknowledged his calling, and the others, being tried and condemned, their places were filled. Close quote. Ooh, that interesting. That's his commentary on some of the history we've covered in previous episodes.
Interesting stuff. And he, right in the last line of that letter, he also points out that he gathered some high profile followers.
Mm-hmm.
Johnny Page, who's a member of the Quorum of the 12,
Yes.
and William Smith, who's another member of the Quorum of the 12, both eventually affiliate with James Strang and his movement.
Yeah.
He also attracts people like William McClellan,
Yeah.
William Marks,
Mm-hmm.
and a bunch of high profile leadership from Nauvoo.
Even John C. Bennett.
John C.
Yeah. John C. Bennett joins him.
John C. Bennett, which, whoa, I mean, wow. After all the stuff he pulled,
Yeah.
to bring him in is surprising. But I see the appeal. He's producing new scripture.
Uh-huh.
This is a very coherent argument about angelic authority. He says he was
Mhm.
ordained by an angel. I could see how a lot of this would appeal. But I think there's one more thing that really kind of
Mhm.
made Strang appeal to a lot of people, and that was that he denounced plural marriage. He didn't like plural marriage,
Yeah.
and that seems to gather a lot of high-profile followers too.
So for those who were not on board with Brigham Young and the 12 and their practice of plural marriage, this was a viable alternative in their eyes. However, many of those prominent converts fall away when Strang actually embraces polygamy in 1849 when he takes Elvira Field as his second wife.
Mm-hmm.
And for a time, Strang's going to keep that marriage a secret by asking Elvira to dress as a boy. He even takes her on a tour to the East Coast and introduces her to most people as his nephew, Charles J. Douglas. But Strang eventually takes 3 additional wives, making a total of 5 wives. It doesn't seem like polygamy was prominently practiced by very many of Strang's followers. Like one historian estimates that out of 500 families in the primary Strangite settlement, only about 20 practiced plural marriage.
Yeah.
And so that's a pretty minuscule percentage.
We should mention, too, that the Strangites today don't practice plural marriage either.
Right.
So it doesn't seem like
Yeah.
it ever became widespread among them, but James Strang practiced plural marriage.
Yeah. And then in 1849, Strang receives a revelation instructing his followers to establish a community on Beaver Island in Lake Michigan. The revelation read in part, quote, I have given you the islands of the Great Lakes for a possession. There you shall dwell apart from the Gentiles, and none shall make you afraid. For my law shall be kept there, and judgment shall be rendered against those that despise it. Close quote. So following that revelation, the majority of Strang's followers will migrate with him to Beaver Island and establish a settlement there named St. James, after their leader.
Mm-hmm.
And though the Strangites established themselves as an industrious, hardworking people during their stay on the island, there is going to be conflict with the local population there, and even internal dissensions among church members start to increase following the relocation. One of the major sources of conflict is going to stem from the theocratic aspirations set up by Strang, if we could put it that way. He set up an institution that he called, quote, the Halcyon Order of the Illuminati. And members of that institution swore an oath to uphold Strang as, quote, a prince of the Illuminati and to, quote, obey the said James J. Strang and his lawful successors, if any he has, each in his time as the imperial primate, an actual sovereign lord and king on earth. Whoa.
I gotta say, Strang excels at awesome titles for things. Like,
Yeah.
the Halcyon Order of the Illuminati, like, that's objectively amazing.
Yeah. The imperial primate.
And Imperial Primate, just
Yeah.
cool stuff. Like, honestly, I just dig the titles that they use in this movement.
Yeah, so it's very monarchical, right, what he is establishing. And he takes his role as imperial primate seriously. He even holds like a coronation ceremony
Hmm.
after he and his followers relocated to Beaver Island. He was actually crowned in this elaborate ceremony on July 8th, 1850, where one description says he was dressed in a flowing, floor length robe of red flannel trimmed with white flannel and black specks, and he held a wooden scepter. On his breast was a large metal star. On his head was a mitre ornamented with metal stars. He was kind of dressed in a way that represented Jewish priests, Jewish high priests.
Hmm.
On his head was a crown. It was made out of paper, but it was decorated with gilt stars and trimming. And he used his wooden scepter even to ordain some of his followers. He called his scepter the Scepter of Judah and ordained George Adams as the prime minister of the kingdom. He also called 8 other men to serve as nobles in the kingdom. So this feels very monarchical. I don't think went over very well in the United States of America.
Could I add too? I've seen the scepter.
Oh, really?
The scepter is in possession of Community of Christ. We
Mm.
took photographs of it for 50 Relics of the Restoration.
Oh, cool.
I asked Bill Shepard, who's a Strangite historian, if that's the real scepter. He says, yeah, it has a clear provenance. It's probably it. The scepter is, made of pine wood. I think it's deliberately simple. I think that's part of the reason why the crown was of paper, was they were trying to convey like magnificence, but not opulent,
Hmm.
if that's fair to say.
Yeah.
But this is kind of cool. And Chris Blythe and others have pointed out that, hey, Joseph Smith may have been designated as a king in Nauvoo. I don't think he went through any elaborate ceremony like this, but that Strang was hearkening back to some of the stuff that may have happened in Nauvoo. So this might not be as out there as sometimes it sounds.
Seems like a variation on the theme of the Council of 50, right? The Council of 50 were planning to leave the United States and to go out west and to establish the kingdom of God, right? Which would be like the seed kingdom that would rule and reign in the millennium, was kind of like setting up the precursor to when Christ comes to rule and reign. And so, yeah, this seems like a little bit of a riff off of that, perhaps, as well as the idea that in Nauvoo, Joseph was ordaining men and women, kings and queens, priests and priestesses,
Mm-hmm.
not to have any governmental rule here per se now, but in preparation for the millennial reign of Jesus. And so I sometimes think that gets a little bit garbled, as though Joseph was some megalomaniac.
Yeah.
I think he was establishing himself as a leader of the kingdom of God on earth in preparation for the coming of Christ. At least that's my reading of the Council of 50 Minutes, to establish an independent government because the U.S. government had failed them so many times.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure James Strang is doing the same thing here. What's your take on that?
I think James Strang's followers would say he was kind of doing the same thing.
Mm.
At the same time, it was kind of like Beaver Island was sort of intended to be both a religious and political kingdom. But you could make the case that in Utah during this time, it was sort of the same way, where
Mhm.
Brigham Young was the religious and secular leader of the territory. So I wouldn't judge this too harshly just because it was
Yeah.
a very different time. And he is in this area where, on all practical levels, he's the spiritual and political leader of his people.
Yeah, good point. And depending on the sources, Strang is sometimes depicted as like a really conscientious leader who looked after the needs of his people, or as the ruler of, quote, as one of his biographers says, a totalitarian society in which expressions of dissent were dealt with harshly, close quote.
Yeah.
So depends on the source. But
Mm-hmm.
eventually, conflict arises between the Strangites and their Gentile neighbors on Beaver Island. There was a small conflict called the Battle of Pine River that was fought between the two factions, though Strang eventually was betrayed by 2 of his own followers, and this leads to his death. 2 of his followers, named Thomas Bedford and Alexander Wentworth,
Mm-hmm.
on June 16th, 1856, as Strang was walking up the gangplank to pay a visit to the captain of the visiting U.S. warship Michigan, he was ambushed by these 2 apostates, and they just start firing on him. They fire several shots at Strang. One hits him in the head, another rips into his right eye. As he collapsed to the ground, Bedford comes and shoots him in the back, and then began to hit him with the butt of his weapon until the pistol broke. Both of those men then ran aboard the Michigan, the boat, who were seeking asylum from the Strangites on the island, who had begun to run toward the dock after hearing all that commotion. But miraculously, actually, Strang didn't die immediately. Like, his physician said that his wounds were fatal, and when some of his followers found him, he was scarcely recognizable, But they take him back to Voorhee and nurse him back to some semblance of health. And he actually survives for several weeks in spite of those wounds, which is amazing. And on at least one occasion, one of his followers asked him if he was going to appoint a successor. Tears formed in Strang's eyes, and he said, quote, "I do not want to talk about it," close quote. Ooh. And then he dies on July 9th, 1856, exactly 6 years and 1 day after he was officially coronated. So, wow. In terms of succession, then, James Strang does not lay out a clear path.
Which is crazy, right? He's alive for several weeks,
Yeah.
but he just doesn't name a successor, which is interesting.
Yeah. Those of his movement were forcefully expelled from Beaver Island while Strang was actually still alive on his deathbed. Armed mobs come in, ranging all over the island, gathering the Strangites to docks, forcing them under threat of death to get into ships and causing them to leave. Most of them will head back to Voorhee, Wisconsin, where the movement had begun. And the crudely worded manifesto of the mob declared, quote, "The dominion of King Strang is at an end." And so, and one historian called the day of the expulsion of the Strangites from Beaver Island, quote, "the most disgraceful day in Michigan history." Without a clear successor, the followers of James Strang dwindle. According to their official website, as you mentioned, Casey, the church today only has about 130 members, mostly in and around Burlington, Wisconsin. They don't believe that a prophet has been called since James Strang, but they do believe that one will be called in the future. And interestingly, while not many of the followers of James Strang remain today, he did gather, we have to give him credit for this, he did gather the largest restoration movement outside of Brigham Young to that point in time, which is amazing, right?
Yeah.
And many of those who left Strang after he began practicing plural marriage and those in the aftermath of the expulsion from Beaver Island, they now start to search for a new leader, someone who can unite the branches of the restoration who chose not to follow Brigham Young to the west. And that leads to our next movement.
Yeah. So Strang and his movement are relatively small, but
Yes.
they're influential. And that's why we'd mention them here.
Yeah.
The reason why we do that too is because it's sort of prelude to what becomes the largest branch of the Restoration outside of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And this is one many have heard of, probably the most well-known. They're known today as Community of Christ, but for most of their history, in fact, prior to 2001, they were known as the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Yeah.
They're pretty open, Scott, in saying the reason why they changed their name to Community of Christ is because they were confused with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints all the time.
All the time.
If you've interacted with them, chances are it was through one of the historic sites. A lot of our listeners will have heard of Community of Christ because recently, back in March 2024, they sold the Kirtland Temple and most of their historic properties in Nauvoo, and a lot of historic artifacts like the Joseph Smith translation manuscripts and the Bible Joseph Smith used for his translation, the Door to Liberty Jail, Joseph and Emma portraits, several letters that were important. And so this is the next biggest restoration movement.
Yeah.
There's also some good histories that they've written because they're a little bit bigger. They have some good history.
Yeah, so we just said that the Strangite movement was the largest restoration movement besides the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now we're saying the Community of Christ was. And just to be clear on that, it's because the Strangites movement actually dwindled before the Community of Christ rose. So up to that time, Strangites were the largest, but then comes the Community of Christ, which, as you're mentioning, which today is definitely the second largest ever in the restoration movement to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Just wanted to clarify.
I work a lot with Community of Christ. And again, we're going to let them represent their own story. But some of them would say, yeah, it was an outgrowth of Strang's movement that became Community of Christ. Others of them would say, well, a lot of Strang's followers eventually formed Community of Christ, but that they don't want to link the two movements because, to be honest, they don't follow a lot of what Strang taught. Most of them had kind of peeled off before Strang started getting into some of his more unique teachings within his church. Okay, so the two key figures here appear to be Jason W. Briggs, who's the leader of the church in a town called, I hope I'm saying this right, but Beloit. It looks French, Beloit, Wisconsin.
Beloy. Yeah.
Beloit, and William Marks, who we've talked about before. William Marks is the stake president in Nauvoo.
Mm-hmm.
He supports Sidney Rigdon, but he kind of goes off and does his own thing after Rigdon moves back to Pittsburgh. So Jason Briggs, eventually he decides to follow James Strang, but he becomes disillusioned when Strang begins practicing plural marriage. In 1851, Briggs has a spiritual experience that convinced him that the leader of the church should be from the seed of Joseph, meaning, well, seed of Joseph, I'll leave out there, but probably saying we need a family member of Joseph Smith to lead the church.
Yeah, a descendant of Joseph.
A descendant of Joseph. So a few years later, they approached Joseph Smith III. Joseph Smith III is living in Nauvoo. He is taking care of Emma Smith, who's there. His brothers are there. At this point in time, Joseph III, this is how members of Community of Christ refer to him, so we're not trying to be disrespectful or anything. Joseph III is affectionately how they refer to him. He actually refuses to talk to them at first. He's kind of seen the trauma, he's witnessed and lived kind of in the wreckage of Nauvoo, and he's not super interested in being part of it at first.
So they're proposing to him, you should lead the church, and
You should lead the church. Yeah.
saying, I'm not interested.
Yeah. At first, he's not interested, but he eventually does have a spiritual experience that convinces him that he should lead the church. And at the age of 27, so he's really young, he's ordained at a conference in Amboy, Illinois on April 6th, 1860. So 30 years to the day after the original church is organized, Joseph Smith III steps up to leadership in the church. And this is how they typically date the beginning of their church as starting, though Jason Briggs and William Marks.
So that puts the R in the RLDS church.
Yeah.
This is the moment of reorganization.
Yeah, and we're going to use the name RLDS mostly here because they don't go by Community of Christ until later, but just recognize those two terms are interchangeable with each other.
Yeah.
During the early years of the RLDS church, there's a lot of emphasis on lineal succession because that's their big claim, is that the prophetic office was supposed to pass from father to son, which you find in the Book of Mormon and in the Bible in several situations. Just as evidence of this, and we're working off an RLDS historian named Bill Russell. Bill Russell's a good guy, I know him. The True Latter-day Saints Herald, that's the major publication of the church, publishes 13 major essays on lineal succession during its first 3 years. And these essays have titles like Lineal Priesthood, The Preeminent Birthright of the Tribe of Joseph, The Lineal Transmission of the Priesthood from the Days of Adam to Last Days. Again, you'll see words like lineal. And then there's a ton of other articles that just make reference to this. And they do send like missionaries to Utah to try and convert the main church. In fact, Joseph III and his brothers come to Utah to basically tell everybody, hey, we're back. This is interestingly when a lot of people step forward and talk about plural marriage in Nauvoo because they're trying to explain to Joseph III and his brothers that no, Joseph Smith actually did introduce plural marriage. Here's some of the people that were involved. There's some interesting family interactions between Joseph III, who's leading the RLDS church, and Joseph F. Smith, his first cousin, Hiram Smith's son, who by this point has become a prominent leader in the Utah church. And so interesting stuff going on.
Yeah. Both sides trying to convince the other side, right, that they're legitimate.
Yeah, this kind of intra-family dispute, right? There's even a time when they go fishing on Utah Lake together. Like crazy stuff happens during this time.
That's awesome.
Now, I'm going to say this. Joseph Smith III, by any metric, is a really remarkable leader. Like he's pretty incredible. And his DNA, his efforts are all over the church. In my experience, people from Community of Christ talk about Joseph III the way we talk about Joseph Jr. Like he's the guy that set up everything. He leads the church from 1860 until his death on December 10th, 1914, when he's 82 years old. So,
holy cow.
He leads the church for over 50 years, 54 years.
Wow.
And the other thing is, in leading the church, he brings together a lot of different groups. So there's a lot of these groups in the Midwest that are kind of running around on their own, and Joseph III sort of unites them. But because of that, what you see in Community of Christ and the RLDS tradition is this very like strict emphasis on parliamentary procedure. We want to make sure everybody's heard. When you go to their world conferences, it's more of a legislative session where everybody's proposing things and they're kind of working it out and figuring things out. that comes from the fact that he had to bring together a bunch of different people that had a lot of different ideas about how things were supposed to work, where the Trek West kind of fused our tradition into this very like, hey, it's do or die. We got to follow the leaders that we have.
Yeah.
Now, he also does some great things. He helps them publish the inspired translation of the Bible. They have access to the Joseph Smith translation manuscript, so they publish that.
Yeah.
We don't even get access to that until the 1970s. So other than the parts that are in the Pearl of Great Price, we don't use the Joseph Smith translation until we can look at it for ourselves, and then it becomes popular. We've done a whole episode on this.
Yeah.
Another thing about Joseph III was that he strongly denied that his father was ever involved in plural marriage. And that becomes kind of an important platform of the faith. For instance, Jason Briggs, the guy who approached Joseph III, actually leaves the faith in 1886 because he wants Joseph III to acknowledge that Joseph Smith Jr. was the originator of plural marriage. And when Joseph III refuses, Jason Briggs and several of the people that followed him were kind of invited to leave the church. And so...
Wow. So it's not that Briggs was proposing that we live plural marriage. He's just saying, please acknowledge that your father started it.
Yeah.
And Joseph Smith III would not.
Yeah, Joseph III denies that until the day he dies.
Do you think it's because of his mom? Because he interviews Emma, and Emma says, no, Joseph didn't practice this.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, obviously, she's hugely influential on him.
Yeah.
And a lot of historians have played around with that last interview and wondered, was it carefully worded in a way that she wasn't not telling the truth? Because again, like the way they think of plural marriage is different than the way we think of civil marriage and things like that. But the bottom line is it's our religion without plural marriage. And I'll add to, they also don't believe in or practice temple ordinances because they believe those are linked to plural marriage. So
yeah,
they do believe in temples, but in a different sense than we do.
More as like administrative and gathering places for conference, right? Rather than a place of ritual ordinances.
Yeah, temples aren't for ordinances. They're kind of dedicated to God, and they serve as headquarter buildings for the church.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, when it comes to succession, this is what Bill Russell, our LDS historian we're using here, he wrote that Joseph III understood two principles with respect to succession. One, the president should be called by revelation, and he should be a worthy lineal descendant of Joseph the martyr. So the president calls his successor by revelation, and that successor should be a descendant of Joseph Smith.
Okay.
So this is how this plays out in Community of Christ.
So do we have an unbroken chain of Joseph Smith's successors all the way down in Community of Christ because of that?
Sorta. Okay. We're going to walk you through that.
Yeah.
But they did follow lineal succession until 1995.
Okay.
Again, in our church, a lot of times, because they're not led by a descendant of Joseph Smith today, we'll say, well, they broke their own tradition. But it's actually more complicated than that.
Yeah.
For instance, Joseph III's oldest son is Frederick Smith, and he's an ordained an elder when he's 23, but his dad, Joseph III, was worried that up to that point, he hadn't shown a ton of interest in church work, and he also wasn't very active after his ordination. In fact, at least one apostle in the church opposed Frederick's ordination because he didn't think he'd shown enough interest. And his dad calls his son Freddie in all the writings, said, you know what, he'll eventually come around. In 1902, he brings him into the first presidency, and Frederick Smith starts to, get interested in this, show a proclivity towards leadership. So in 1906, Joseph III received a revelation. This is now section 127 of the RLDS Doctrine and Covenants that designates Frederick as his successor.
Okay.
But Joseph III is also conscious of how complicated it was when his father died. So before Joseph III dies in 1914, he writes a long letter, just simply entitled The Letter of Instruction, that's intended to establish the principles of succession in the RLDS tradition. You hear this referred back to all the time. They do have some messy successions, but for instance, when Frederick Smith died in 1946, they refer to the Letter of Instruction. In 1995, when a major change happens in succession, they still refer to it. But Roger Launius, who wrote probably the best biography on Joseph III, notes that the Letter of Instruction was not endorsed by the RLDS Quorum of the 12, but it did become precedent. So some of the leaders don't endorse it, but it gets referred back to over and over and over again. So we're going through their office. Frederick Smith takes over, and he serves from the death of his father until 1946. In 1938, he gave verbal instructions to the members of the 12 and the presiding bishopric of the church that if anything were to happen to him, if he were to pass away, he wanted his brother Israel to take over as president of the church.
Okay.
And around this time, Israel Smith is called into the first presidency to help prepare him for his future calling. Okay.
Okay.
So after Frederick passes away, it's not an instantaneous thing. The 12 take over leading the church for a little while. They actually asked Albert A. Smith, who was the presiding patriarch and who was the first cousin to Frederick and Israel, to seek the will of the Lord. And he eventually gives his approval that Israel A. Smith should take over as leader of the church. So this is the second son of Joseph III to lead the church, Israel A. Smith. So Joseph III, Frederick Madison Smith, Israel A. Smith. Those are the first three.
Okay.
And it's kind of remarkable that coming up on the century mark, by the time we get to the 1950s, they've only had three leaders because Joseph III serves for so long.
54 years.
Yeah. But Israel A. Smith is a lawyer, and he's really familiar with the history of the church, and he's a little bit worried about the uncertainty that surrounded the first two successions. And so he writes a really specific letter where he says in the event of his death, his brother, William Wallace Smith, should take his place as president of the church. And the letter was written in 1952, and it proves to be an inspired move because in June 1958, Israel is killed in a car accident.
Oh.
So Israel's gone, but they find the letter, and the letter designates W. Wallace Smith to become president of the church. So that's the third son of Joseph III.
Third son of Joseph Smith III.
Yeah.
Wow. So this isn't father to son. This is father to brother to brother to brother now.
Father to son to brother to brother to brother. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
W. Wallace Smith becomes president of the church. He's the one that starts to make major changes. So,
okay, like what?
During his presidency, they start to become a little bit more open, especially towards members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Some historians in the church started to acknowledge that Joseph Smith played a role in plural marriage and the introduction of temple ordinances. That causes kind of seismic shifts within the church.
Wow.
To our benefit, W. Wallace appoints a new church historian, Richard Howard. Richard Howard's awesome. I've interviewed him, who allows people from the Utah church to come and look at their holdings. And this leads to Robert Matthews and the Joseph Smith translation coming into kind of our discussion, our discourse surrounding the scriptures.
Yeah.
He's super progressive. And he also does something that's unprecedented too. Instead of serving until his death, in 1976, W. Wallace receives a revelation that he's going to retire in 2 years and that his son, Wallace B. Smith, is going to become prophet and president designate. So he's the first RLDS leader to not serve until death. He's going to retire, and his son's going to take over.
A revelation that he should retire in 2 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that leads to Wallace B. Smith. And if I say Wally B. or Wallace B., this is how members of Community of Christ refer to him, like very affectionately. Not trying to be disrespectful here. Wallace B. Smith is incredibly progressive also, but his presidency is also really controversial.
Yeah.
So in 1984, he announced a revelation stating that the temple would be built in Independence, Missouri. He also granted women the right to priesthood office.
Oh, that's a big deal.
Yeah, these are huge things. And a lot of people that you and I are friends with, Scott, split off from the church during this time. Bill Russell, the historian we've been quoting, estimates that about a third of the church may have left
because of these innovations
and changes that happened.
So it was granting women the right to priesthood office. And if I remember right, it was relegating the role of the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith Jr., correct?
I mean, I don't know if there's an official movement that kind of does that. That might be unfair for us to say. It seems like the ordination of women, and a lot of the people that we have talked to that left the church during this time do say they felt like the Book of Mormon was being de-emphasized.
Yeah.
A lot of the people that left were kind of the more conservative end of the spectrum in the church. They saw Wallace B. and his presidency as super liberal, and they were uncomfortable with the changes. And honestly, some of them I've talked to, and this isn't across the board, were uncomfortable with the idea of lineal succession ending, which they had started to talk about. So Wallace B. Smith, final controversial things he does is he chooses to retire rather than serve unto death like his father, and he appoints a president of the church that is not a Smith for the first time. So
Not even related to Joseph Smith.
Not even related to Joseph Smith. No, this
Mm.
guy's name is W. Grant McMurray. Again, the first president of the church to not be a Smith, but he was like really well trained. Like he'd served as the World Church Secretary for 10 years. He was counseled in the first presidency.
Mm.
And according to Bill Russell, there were protesters outside when this happened, but when the decision was actually made in World Conference, it wasn't controversial. But Bill says it may have been because everybody that would have objected was already like
They're
not
already
in
gone.
the church. They were already gone.
So Wallace B. Smith is bringing some serious innovations. It's women in the priesthood. It's that the president of the church no longer needs to be a Smith,
Mm-hmm.
and some relegation of the importance and role of the Book of Mormon. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
I should clarify a couple of things. First, priesthood is treated differently in the church, in RLDS Community of Christ tradition,
Mm-hmm.
where they follow more of a Protestant model, where there's like a pastor and a limited, like most members of the church don't hold the priesthood. It's more like a Protestant church where there's a couple people that do, but everybody else is considered kind of a lay member.
Mm-hmm.
And so in dialogue with Community of Christ, we asked, how many people hold the priesthood total in your church? Their estimate, and I hope I'm not misquoting, was about 10% total.
Okay.
So it was that women could be ordained to the same offices as men. So now they have female pastors and evangelists, and they use a lot of different names than we do, though some names like elders and teachers and priests and deacons are the same.
Okay. So then Grant McMurray becomes president.
Grant McMurray, and he serves from 1996 until November 29th, 2004. And this is where it gets even twistier. This is why I would say this is the most controversial succession in the church. So in November 2004, and by the way, he's the one that changes the name to Community of Christ. In 2001, they announce that's going to be the official name of the church,
Okay.
even though the incorporated name of the church is still the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Okay. So Grant McMurray changes that.
Yeah, he does a lot of things that are sort of controversial. Like he institutes open communion, which is the idea that anybody can come to their church and take the Lord's Supper. Prior to that time, they had closed communion, where you had to be a member of the church to take the Lord's Supper.
What are we? Are we open communion or closed communion?
I think we're open communion because I've never heard it come up. And I don't know if we ever were closed communion, but at least in my lifetime, and I'm not a spring chicken, I've never seen anybody refuse to serve the sacrament, whether they were a member or not. I think we would just say, hey, if they haven't made the covenants, then it's a simple act of devotion on their part. So I think we're open communion.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. That's interesting.
McMurray also expresses his openness to the idea that the Book of Mormon isn't historical, that it might not be an actual history. He also expresses that maybe the church should have been a little more cautious before canonizing new revelations to see if they meet the test of time. This is all according to Bill Russell and his article on succession.
Can you imagine the church president saying, we're open to the idea that the Book of Mormon may not be historical?
Yeah, this would be a huge thing in our church. But just to provide a little context, McMurray actually is super open about his faith. And he talks about how by the time he was a student at Graceland University, which is kind of their church's official university, he hadn't read the Book of Mormon. And when he went and talked to the religion faculty there, none of them had read the Book of Mormon either.
Oh, okay.
And so it doesn't seem like the Book of Mormon was ever emphasized as strongly in the RLDS tradition as it was in our tradition. And some people would argue that the Book of Mormon being emphasized as a source for doctrine is really something that started, say in the 1950s and sort of reached its apex under President Benson in the 1980s. So again, he's not a radical if he comes out and says this. I think a lot of church members were thinking the same thing, and a lot of church members that felt more strongly about the Book of Mormon as a historical record had left by the time he becomes president of the church. So
yeah, interesting.
Here's where it gets controversial with succession. So McMurray shocks a lot of people when he announces his resignation. And in the resignation, he just references some health problems that he's having. And he also mentions some inappropriate choices that he's made.
Oh.
And he declines to name a successor. So for the first time in the history of this church, a president left without naming a successor.
Okay.
And that makes it probably the biggest succession crisis in their history.
Yeah, talk about being left hanging.
Yeah.
What are church members to do in that case, right?
Yeah. So the church is led briefly by the two counselors in the first presidency. That's Kenneth Robinson and Peter Judd. They lead the church from the time McMurray resigns until a special world conference that's held the following year. And at the conference, the two counselors announced a process of discernment to obtain God's will for who should lead the church. They also note that they're consulting with the Quorum of the 12. They quote Joseph III's letter of instruction, and they invite members of the church to give input to the process.
Oh.
They even call for a special day of prayer to resolve the question in the months leading up to World Conference. So,
Whoa, so this is like a big shift.
this is huge, right?
Yeah.
So what happens is they hold a meeting March 2nd, 2005, and announce that Stephen M. Vesey, who's 48 years old, would lead the church. That's just a kid in our,
Yeah.
in our perspective of things, right?
Who's Stephen M. Vesey?
Stephen M. Vesey at the time was the second youngest apostle, but he was serving as president of the Quorum of the 12. So president of the Quorum of the 12 becomes leader of the church. President Vesey is held in high esteem at World Conference. He's sustained, according to Bill Russell, with fewer than 10 people opposing his sustaining as leader of the church. And so the fact that in 2005, the president of their Quorum of the 12 becomes their leader of the church prompted a lot of people on our side of things to be like, oh, you guys finally found the right way to do it. Though Bill Russell emphasizes, hey, it's not the same as the pattern of succession in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So
we saw some superficial similarities, but but Bill clarifies.
Bill sets us straight. So here's what Bill writes. He says, here's the differences. First, church members outside of the 12 are eligible for the office.
Wow.
We've never chosen a president of the church that wasn't part of the Quorum of the 12. And we've already said this is part of our process now.
Yeah.
Second, Vesey was not the senior apostle, and by chronological age, he was the second youngest apostle. Vesey called the youngest apostle, David D. Shaw, age 47, to be one counselor in the first presidency, and retained as his other counselor Kenneth N. Robinson, who had served in the first presidency throughout McMurray's tenure. Thus, the two youngest apostles in the community of Christ were chosen to be the president and a member of the new first presidency.
Interesting.
Then he adds, finally, Vesey's selection occurred only after a period of discernment, in which not only the 12 and other leading officers, but the entire church membership was encouraged to submit names and to pray for divine guidance in the discernment process. Therefore, it was not an automatic appointment of the senior apostle, but an unpredetermined choice by the 12. It was an open process which Community of Christ members see as guided in significant ways by the Holy Ghost.
Wow.
And so it does appear, though, that this idea of discernment in the entire church, seeking discernment, is something that might stick around because Stephen Vesey has led the church since that time to the time of this recording. And when he announced that he was going to retire, which he did last year, he announced a period of discernment as well. In fact, it wasn't even last year. It was at their last World Conference. He announced, I'm thinking about retiring. I'd like the church to start entering into discernment about who the new leader of the church should be.
Okay, so a period of discernment, quote unquote, means it's a time for church members and church leaders to begin praying for the Holy Spirit of God to make manifest who the next leader should be. Something like that?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And I will point out, I've met Stephen Vesey. He is a very, very nice guy. And he's led the church through some major challenges. Like in 2017, they announced that they were having budgetary issues, that they had a $115 million budget shortfall, that they were going to consider selling historic properties to help meet the needs of their employees. And so even prior to that time, they had sold a couple things like Joseph Smith's home and Hans Mill to the church. That was a few years earlier. Shortly after he makes that announcement, they sell the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon, which is the earliest complete manuscript of the Book of Mormon, to our church. And then all of this kind of culminates this year in 2024 when they sell the Kirtland Temple, their Nauvoo properties, and all those historic artifacts that we've talked about.
Yeah.
So he kind of gets the church on a more stable financial ground so that they're able to meet their needs and have an operating budget. And then in 2023, March 6, 2023, he announces that he's going to retire in 2025. So we're up to the present. And then he announces this period of discernment. Let's take some time and think about who the new president of the church should be.
Yeah.
Earlier in this year, January 18th, 2024, Stacy Cram was announced to be his successor after several meetings of key quorums in the church. And she'll officially be the first female president of Community of Christ. So they do return to that pattern of the prophet designates his successor, but they also add in this idea of discernment and that the decision is going to be made by the leading quorums of the church and not the president solely by himself.
And what do we know about Stacey Cram?
Not a ton. Everybody that I know of speaks highly of her. Again, I work with a lot of people in Community of Christ, but I don't know a ton about her personally, and I haven't met her personally.
Okay. Actually, I just Googled Stacey Cram, and it says on the Community of Christ website that she serves currently as a member of the First Presidency and counselor to the president of the church.
Okay.
In the past, she has served as a presiding bishop, as a member of the Council of the 12 Apostles, etc. So, yeah, she's been in church leadership for several years now and is soon to become president of the church in 2025. How about that?
Yeah. She seems like she's seasoned church leader, steady hand.
Yeah.
And just to bring this back, you can see Succession's undergone some changes in Community of Christ, but it's not quite as inconsistent as sometimes members of our church characterize it to be. It's clear that Joseph III believed in lineal succession. However,
Yeah.
he also believed that the president of the church would designate their successor. And that seems to be, other than 2005 and Grant McMurray, the consistent thing that's happened is that the leader of the church has had a hand in choosing their successor. There are largest restoration faith behind us, and their process of succession often comes up, but I think they're a little bit more consistent than we give them credit for.
So the consistency is that the president designates his successor, not so much that the successor always needs to be a descendant of Joseph Smith Jr.
Yeah.
Okay. There you go. That's Community of Christ. All right, to wrap this up, we want to cover one more movement of the Restoration that is based in Pennsylvania. This is the third largest denomination that believes in the Book of Mormon, though they do not use the Doctrine and Covenants or Pearl of Great Price. Members of this church believe that Sidney Rigdon was the rightful successor of Joseph Smith. However, their tradition is more complicated than that.
Yeah.
Casey, tell us who we're talking about here.
Yeah, so this is the Church of Jesus Christ, and I'm going to refer to them as the Bickertonites.
Mm-hmm.
I just went to Pennsylvania, actually, and hung out with the Bickertonites for a day.
Awesome.
And visited a bunch of their churches, and I just peppered them with questions the whole time. Like, as soon as I stepped out of the car, I read Larry Watson's history of their church and said, hey, you guys only baptize in natural settings? And they were like, yeah, they only baptize in natural settings. And I was like, what about a reservoir? Is that natural? And they were like, yeah, close enough. So wonderful, wonderful people. And by the way, Scott, while I was with them, the day I spent with them, they actually gave me the 2-volume history of their church.
Oh, wow.
And I'm reading through it right now.
That's awesome.
But a lot of what we're going to say here comes from an earlier article that Larry Watson, who I've met as well, he's a great guy, wrote about their church. So, Bickertonite friends, I'm going to use the word Bickertonite. Please don't be upset. And I'm going to be using Larry Watson's history. So call him if I get anything wrong. No, we welcome corrections.
So how does it start?
Okay, Sidney Rigdon, after what happens in Nauvoo, is excommunicated, and then he leaves. And he goes back to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is where he had been living for several months before the martyrdom of Joseph and Hiram. So while he's there, he converts this guy named William Bickerton, a local coal miner. Bickerton is a good leader and a good teacher, but he very quickly becomes disillusioned with Sidney Rigdon and doesn't think that Sidney Rigdon's on the right track. He actually writes this. He said, Sidney Rigdon went wrong after he came to Pittsburgh. He wanted to make a gathering in the Emlenton Valley of the Allegheny Mountains. At the same time, he had organized the School of the Prophet or Solemn Assemblies, and many things were revealed to us showing things were going wrong. After Rigdon went wrong, all that followed him fell away, and I was left alone. And so at this point, William Bickerton's flying solo, and he's wondering if he should just give up when he has an experience. He says the following: in the vision, I was on the highest mountain in the earth, and God told me that if I did not preach the gospel, I would fall into a dreadful chasm below. The sight thereof was awful. I was moved with fear, having the Holy Spirit. Here there was none to assist me, and without learning, popular opinion against me, and the Salt Lake Mormons stood in the way. I should not return back into Methodism again, No, I knew they had not the gospel. I stood in contemplation. The chasm was before me, and no other alternative but to do my duty to God and man. I went ahead preaching repentance towards God and faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. Some believed my testimony and were baptized, and we met together. So he has a visionary experience that convinces him to continue. Some years later, in fact, around 1851 or 1852, he did become affiliated with our church. But the story goes, and some of this is controversial history, that Bickerton was wary of plural marriage and asked if our church was practicing plural marriage. He was told by the local missionaries that we weren't because we hadn't publicly announced it.
Yeah.
But then when the church publicly announced they were practicing plural marriage, Bickerton decides to leave our church. So he publicly splits with the church. He openly declares it in his congregation. And it's around this time that Bickerton decides he's only going to teach from the Bible and the Book of Mormon. He doesn't accept the Doctrine and Covenants because he feels it introduces doctrines that were contrary to the gospel, like baptism for the dead and plural marriage. So he's going to do his own thing, and he formally organizes the Church of Christ. And early on, they were going by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They eventually simplify. They're formally organized in 1862. And then a couple interesting things happen. Members of the Church of Jesus Christ, the Bickertonites, believe strongly in the destiny of the American Indians. They try to set up a gathering place in Kansas where they can more easily minister to, do missionary work among the Native Americans. However, this leads to kind of a schism in the church too, where William Bickerton is the leader of the church in the West, and William Cadman, another prominent church leader, becomes leaders of the church in the East.
Okay.
And this kind of comes to a head in 1880 when William Bickerton is accused of improper conduct by a member of the church. The cause is, quote, causing a separation in his family and for acting in a manner that was not becoming a church member.
Okay.
This is still controversial among Bickertonites because Bickerton basically said he didn't do anything wrong. He was counseling a woman who was in a difficult marriage. However, a church convened council ruled against him and he's suspended from the church.
Oh, wow.
During this time, a lot of the church follows William Cadman. Some people follow William Bickerton, and there's actually a schism in the church that lasts for around 20 years or so.
Wow.
So
they eventually come back together 20 years later?
They eventually come back together. Yeah, I've had one Bickertonite historian say William Cadman and William Bickerton both, William Bickerton was getting to the end of his life and he didn't want schism to be his legacy. So he comes back into the church in 1902. He dies in the faith in 1905. William Cadman officially is the leader of the church during this time. He serves until 1905 when he passes away. Then Alexander Cherry takes over, leader of the church. And all along the way, they're having discussions about, how they should lead the church. One of the biggest controversies when Alexander Cherry was the leader of the church is, should the first presidency be separate from the 12, or should they be within the 12? Which we had that discussion in our history.
Each movement needs to make their decision about that. Yeah.
They decide ultimately that the first presidency will be within the 12. It's not going to be a separate organization. They're going to choose 3 apostles, but they'll still be kind of a part of the Quorum of the 12. So Alexander Cherry leads the church until 1921. Then William H. Cadman, who's the son of William Cadman, takes over. He extends missionary work into Native American groups in Canada. They start to do missionary work in Nigeria. A lot of the membership of the Bickertonite church is outside the United States in places like Africa, Central America, South America. He serves until 1963. So a long stretch for William H. Cadman.
Wow.
When Thurman Fernier takes over for just 2 years, he's followed by Gori Siriavino, who leads the church from 1965 to 1974.
Okay.
Then Dominique Thomas leads the church from 1974 to 2005. And this is getting us up to the current era, where when Larry Watson wrote his history, Paul Palmieri was president of the church. However, in 2018, Paul Palmieri was succeeded by Joel Gailey, who actually was one of the people I met with when I went to Pennsylvania. President Gailey's a great guy, wonderful guy. But around this time, when they're doing the succession for President Palmieri to Joel Gailey, they decide that the leader of the church should have term limits.
Okay.
Essentially, the leader of the church, the general president is the title they would use, who heads the first presidency, is going to serve for roughly an 8-year term with a possible 2-year extension.
Oh, okay.
So this happens around 2018.
Very recent.
that would mean that in 2 years, President Gailey's going to come up they could extend his presidency for 2 years. Release, I guess you'd say it. And I'm being more formal than they are. When I was there, I kept saying, President Gailey, what do you think about this? And he was like, it's just Brother Joel,
Brother Joel. Okay.
And Brother Bob and Brother Josh and all the people that I met with were on a first name basis. They know each other relatively well.
Mm.
They hold general conferences in a conference center they have in Pennsylvania that I was able to visit while I was there.
Mm-hmm.
And we walked through a lot of their beliefs, but in a couple weeks, Josh Gailey is actually going to be here and explain their beliefs. So
on our show, we're excited for that. That'll be awesome. Josh is a great guy.
So they're like us in a lot of ways, but different in crucial ways too. Like I know people from the Bickertonite church that know the Book of Mormon as well as any religion professor at BYU. Like they can quote chapter and verse. They know their stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They don't use the Doctrine and Covenants. They don't build temples, though they do believe in the city of Zion. They don't necessarily believe that there's going to be a temple at the center of the city of Zion.
Mm.
They have a lot of other kind of cool beliefs that we'll let Josh kind of explain.
Wow.
That's the third largest branch and one that we're just barely establishing relationships with. And we're learning a ton about them right now. So this process of the restoration family kind of coming back together is happening right before your eyes. In fact, a lot of you could help with this.
Mm.
A lot of scholars and people right now are playing a role in helping us learn what they believe and correctly represent them.
Build bridges. Yeah.
Build bridges. Yeah.
Wow, Casey. That was fun.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. Yeah.
It's a lot. Yeah.
Okay. Let us summarize what we just talked about.
Yeah.
So, okay. Today we reviewed 3 different restoration denominations. We talked about the Strangites. In terms of succession, that's what we're kind of honing in on today. The Strangites believe in succession by special appointment. And since James Strang did not tap a successor, they believe there has not been a prophet since his time, but they believe that one will come at some point.
Yeah, they're open to the idea of future prophets. Yeah.
Community of Christ has evolved in its succession practices. They no longer emphasize the importance of lineal succession, but they have consistently throughout their history believed in and followed the principle that the president chooses his successor, or at least plays a role in choosing the successor. And then third, in the Church of Jesus Christ, Bickertonites, succession has evolved as well to be up to today where the first presidency serves within the Quorum of the 12 and has a standard 8-year term with a possibility of a 2-year extension. So that's how they do succession, which is interesting and unique. Okay, so each of these churches, and ours included, has seen a series of changes, I think it's fair to say, to how succession happens.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that every one of the churches would say the changes came by revelation.
Mm-hmm.
We've kind of explained that our development of succession has been complicated, but we believe that the changes happened under the direction of the Holy Ghost,
right?
That it was inspired, that it was revelatory.
So there you go. So in the following weeks, we're going to invite representatives from each of these churches to come onto the podcast and have their own say. We look forward to learning directly from them. We hope you'll join us as we learn more deeply about our cousins in the restoration.
Restoration cousins. Here we go.
Awesome.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Church History Matters. In our next episode, Casey and I sit down with Dr. Kyle Bashirs, a friend and expert researcher on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Strangites, to take us deeper into understanding that movement. If you're enjoying Church History Matters, we'd appreciate it if you could take a moment to subscribe, rate, review, and comment on the podcast. That makes us easier to find. Today's episode was produced by Scott Woodward and edited by Nick Galletti and Scott Woodward, with show notes and transcript by Gabe Davis. Church History Matters is a podcast of Scripture Central, a nonprofit which exists to help build enduring faith in Jesus Christ by making Latter-day Saints Scripture and church history accessible, comprehensible, and defensible to people everywhere. For more resources to enhance your gospel study, go to scripturecentral.org, where everything is available for free because of the generous donations of people like you. And while we try very hard to be historically and doctrinally accurate in what we say on this podcast, please remember that all views expressed in this and every episode are our views alone and do not necessarily reflect the views of Scripture Central or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Thank you so much for being a part of this with us.